Why am I not allowed delight?
Good afternoon. I'm Ada Hernandez, national correspondent for the Washington Post, and welcome to Washington Post Live for another program in our Race in America series. Joining me today is the newest U.S. Poet Laureate, Ada Limón. Welcome, Ada.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
And a quick note for our audience, we want to hear from you. So please send us your questions for Ada on Twitter using the handle at Post Live. Let's get started. You are the first female U.S. Poet Laureate of Latino and Mexican heritage, and will give your inaugural reading at the Library of Congress later this month. Tell me,
Yes.
what does this moment mean for you?
It is a really incredible experience. And to be honest, it's every day I feel like I have a new emotion about it. In fact, just earlier this morning I was thinking about I sat down at my desk to write and I have all of the pictures of my loved ones, my mother, my grandfather, my friends, my father. And I was thinking about how they're with me and how much work went into their lives and into allowing me to be an artist. And it feels really like an incredible moment that I'm not just experiencing for myself, but I'm experiencing with my ancestors and with my family and with my community. So it feels like a collective experience. And when I think of it that way, I can have that deep breath and actually feel like we're in this together and it's not just me on that stage.
Well, I'm curious about what you mean by that. If we can go a little bit deeper about when you say that, it feels like you're honoring your ancestors is something that's come up in multiple interviews that you've done. How
Yeah.
does your poetry sort of convey, the honoring of your ancestors?
Yeah, I think that part of my sort of personal philosophy as a human being and as an artist is to say thank you and to remember to say thank you. And I think a big part of when I first started out being a poet that I really wanted to find my identity and who I was and speak my truth and all of those beautiful things you want to do in your teens and 20s. And I think as I have grown older, I've really wanted to appreciate uh, the people in my life that have supported me and got me to where I am today. And I think a lot about my grandfather, Francisco Carlos Limon, who was from Mexico, was born in San Juan de los Lagos. And I think, of him as a very creative soul. He was incredibly spirited and had an incredible voice, sang all the time. And yet I don't think he would have allowed himself to be fully an artist, because I think, he had to take things very seriously, um, being someone who had crossed the border, feeling that need to, be sure that he's providing for his family and not taking the risk of art. And, I think about that not just in his generation, but even in my own family. My mother is a painter and did risk, being an artist, and yet I watched her wait tables, as I was a kid, as she was, making her art on the weekends. And I just think that is a big part of my life, is thinking about what they went through and what they've um, overcome in many ways, but also the way that they encourage me and their spirits to encourage me. That's been huge for me, and not everyone has always had that. So it's not something I take for granted.
Well, now you have a big job in front of you, and in things that I've read that where you've been granting interviews, you talk about making poetry more accessible. Well, how do you hope to do that as the poet laureate, and how will you make the role your own?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I think one of the things that I'm fully aware of is that the people that came before me in this position, the incredible Joy Harjo, Tracy K. Smith, Juan Felipe Herrera, um, Natasha Trethewey, not to mention Robert Haas and Billy Collins and Rita Dove, of course, and they've done that work. I think the really good, deep groundwork of letting us know that poetry is there. They've done that work. And so what I would love to do is celebrate poetry's power. And so I'm hoping that in my tenure, I am able to create some sort of public project that would bring poetry into public spaces and maybe allow us to have unexpected experiences with poetry. Um, so that it can surprise us sometimes, maybe delight us, maybe wound us in the right way. Um, so I'm hoping that I can really address the usefulness of poetry. That poetry can be a tool to help us heal, to help us grieve, um, and to remember that we're human beings full of feelings and pain and laughter and joy, and that I think we've been through a lot together and in the last few years here, and I feel like I don't know about you, but I have felt that we've been numb. We've had to go numb to a lot of things because there's been one crisis after the next. And poetry is sort of a place where we can reconnect with our feelings so that we don't go numb.
Well, let's talk about feelings as it pertains to your individual specific work. Your latest book, The Hurting Kind, explores the relationship between humans and nature.
Mhm.
What intrigues you about nature, first of all, and how does it parallel with the human experience?
Yeah, even as a child, I've always been very connected to nature. It's where I've uh, found most of my safe havens or in natural spots. I grew up in Sonoma, California. My There was a creek across the street from my house, the Calabasas Creek, that uh, I would always go to and sit and watch the tadpoles and the little minnows, and it felt like a place of peace, and it felt like a secret place too, and sacred. And so, for me, that's always been a connection that I've had. But I will say that this latest book, The Hurting Kind, that came out in May, really connects again to that idea of the interconnectedness that we have. And I think so often we feel like we are not nature, which is fascinating, right? We don't think of ourselves as animals, and yet we are. And so I think that this book is sort of celebrating that connection. It's also, I think, recognizing that there will always be a mystery and wonder and awe that we have for the natural world. And that, in and of itself, can allow us to maybe take a breath and feel like there's something bigger at work, something larger at work, that here I am, just a poet on this planet in this moment. And it can get you out of your head a little bit. And nature has always done that for me. And I think this book is a way of giving back, not just to the people in my life that I wanted to thank, but to the plants and animals and trees that I wanted to thank too.
So the title, I'm still thinking about that. The hurting kind. What do you mean by that? And what does it mean to be the hurting kind?
Thank you for that question. I had trouble coming up with this title, to be honest. I initially thought The Hurting Kind might be a good title for it, but I was a little scared that it might be off-putting because it has the word hurt in there. But at the same time, the titular poem that this title comes from is really about what it is to be someone who is sensitive to the world, to tender to the world, someone who allows themselves to be pierced by emotions, by grief, by joy. Um, and so I have sort of come to in my life right now, recognize that so much of our conversations are about resilience and bravery and courage and strength and power, and all of those things are wonderful and they're words I love. but um but I think there's also a time where we need to remember also to be tender, to be soft, to receive the world, and to allow ourselves to recognize all the emotions that we're going through, and not just steel ourselves against the wind of the world. And so I think The Hurting Kind, the title itself, is really about honoring and speaking to those of us that allow ourselves to be hurt by the world and allow ourselves to be tender to it and celebrating that emotionality.
On the flip side of the hurting kind, you talk that in your role as U.S. Poet Laureate, that you want to show how poetry can be useful, how it can be a tool. In what ways do you think poetry today, right now, for those who are of the hurting kind, can be
Yeah.
useful?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways. But one of the things that I am very proud of and something I work on that was a project actually by Tracy K. Smith, which is The Slowdown, which is a podcast where you can listen to a poem every single day. And just being able to allow yourself 5 minutes to spend time with poetry in that way, having it read to you, being able to listen to it is beautiful. I think that even just a moment of reading one poem, that's the great thing about poetry. You don't have to read a whole book of poems to have an experience with poetry. You can read one poem and you can find it on Twitter and Instagram, even, or you can find it in your library, however you want to engage with the work. But reading one poem allows you a little bit of breath, a little space. Lorca has that wonderful quote, poetry is like faith. It isn't meant to be understood, but to be received in a state of grace. And I think that's how I think of it, is that it's just that one little moment you can spend with one page, or maybe even a line that affects you and moves you. And so I would recommend reading one poem a day personally.
Switching gears a little bit, at the top of this conversation, I identified you as the first Latina and Mexican poet laureate of Mexican and Latina heritage. But you said
Mm.
before that labels based on race can really just compartmentalize and, in your words, harm us. Can you talk to me about what is assumed and expected of you as a Latina poet?
Yeah. And I think we all have our own individual experiences with our identity and with people around us that want to identify us in certain ways and what that means. And I always come back to that quote by Audre Lorde, who said, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. And I always think about that, eaten alive, right? And so for me, I'm very proud of my Mexican heritage and I'm very proud of being Latina. Um, but I also feel like it's very important for all writers to recognize that we should be able to embrace whatever subjects we want, and we should be able to talk about whatever we want. And one of the things I have realized over my 20 years of writing poetry is that I do think that writers of color oftentimes get asked to address trauma and address injustices in ways that white poets do not get asked to do. And so I think it's really important that as Latinx writers, that we remember that we have the full range of imagination and that no one is allowed to cut us off and tell us, oh, because you're from El Salvador, you must write about this experience, or the only way that I will celebrate you is because you write about this trauma. You know, I want all of the poets to recognize that we can also write about joy and we can also write about heartbreak. Um, and that it's not just one experience, but that we are all of us individuals and having our own experiences and our own musicality. And I think that's taken for granted sometimes. And that can come from outside of our communities. People will want, and sometimes very good heartedly want to celebrate inclusion and diversity. But sometimes in doing so, we'll also say, oh, we want you to speak about this. And I think that as writers of color, sometimes we have to be a little all elbows and say, hey, well, I want to write about a tree. And I especially see that as young people coming up, that I want to make sure they can write about trauma if they want, and they can write about a tree if they want.
You mentioned your grandfather and your mother. First, your grandfather not allowing himself to give space to become an artist. Your mom doing her art on the weekends. But you didn't start out as a poet either. You used to work in marketing. Why did you change career paths, and what did you learn from making that pivot?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's always important to talk about how we make a living as artists. So I actually was a poet that whole time. It wasn't one or the other. It's hard to make a living as a writer, as any kind of artist, and all artists and writers out there listening will know that. And for me, a lot of my friends, beautifully went into teaching. I was someone that, after I graduated with my Master of Fine Arts from NYU in poetry, didn't feel like I was ready to teach. I didn't feel like I had anything to offer. Um, and so I went into working for magazines. I worked for GQ. I was the copy director there. I was the creative services director for Travel and Leisure magazine. Um, and, they were wonderful jobs, but while I was doing that, I put 3 books out, into the world. My first book, Lucky Wreck, my second book, This Big Fake World, and Sharks in the Rivers. And when Sharks in the Rivers came out in 2010, I decided that I was going to try my hand at becoming a full-time writer, whatever that means, whatever that looks like. But I decided to quit, my jobs in, magazine marketing. Yeah.
How does writing poetry allow you to be yourself, your full self?
Mm. I was thinking about that a lot in the last week, actually, because I was feeling off kilter myself. As you might know, you get called to this wonderful position. It's not something you apply for. It's not something you know is coming. um, so there's no. It wasn't what I expected for the next, year, and so there's been a lot of readjustment and beautiful readjustment and reimagining my time and what it will look like and how I want to be of service. But I was feeling off kilter and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. And you know what I did? I literally sat down and I have this journal that I keep with me all the time. It's unlined, and I wrote a couple sort of drafts of poems, just little seeds of poems. And immediately I felt better because the poems were telling me what I was experiencing. They were allowing me to sort of explore what I was going through in my body and my blood and my heart. And I look back on it and go, oh, yes, this is what this is. And I immediately could breathe again. And I felt like, all right, I'm at home in my body. And I'm back in my heart, and I think poetry can do that, And I think oftentimes there are wonderful artists who I admire who want to be sure that we caretake poetry as an art form and as a craft and as a serious craft. And I believe that too. But it doesn't mean that we can't talk about it as healing because I think it heals us every day. Those of us that write it, and most of us that write it do it so that we can stay alive and feel good and live in the world. And I think that anytime someone wants to write a line or write a poem, it doesn't mean you have to publish it. It doesn't mean that it's perfect. It doesn't mean you have to send it to the New Yorker. Um, but it might do something for you. It might open a door. It might be able to let you tap in to how you're actually feeling. And there's something about adding imagination and activating the imagination. The poems aren't always about ideas or feelings. A lot of times they're just about attention. They're about looking deeply at an object, looking deeply at uh, the tree in front of you or whatever's happening. And I think that even just description, being present, looking at something and deeply looking at it is a way of loving the world again. So it's not always just about writing, but it's about writing yourself back into the world.
I mean, I know exactly what you're talking. I mean, for me, it isn't poetry; it's just journaling, and the way I describe it to my friends, it's like your soul is just exhaling, like whatever you holding your breath and inside your heart, it's just an opportunity for you to exhale.
Yeah.
One of the things you said about poetry is that poetry is just telling somebody something. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, and sometimes it's just telling yourself something. Um, I think I all I mean is that I think, as artists and as writers, I think we can sometimes feel like the pressure on the poem that it has to be, divine, that it has to be sort of otherworldly and in some sort of, different earthly vibration, when in reality, a lot of times poems can just be connecting. They can be, slipping the note under someone's door. And I think oftentimes when we start out to write a poem, and maybe the audience is just ourselves and we just need to write it to ourselves, or sometimes it's for a particular person. A lot of the poems in the hurting kind, I sat down and wanted to say, oh, I miss my father. I'm going to write a poem about my father, and then I'm gonna send it to him, and it's a real act of, like, this is an actual connection that I'm doing something, creating a gift, making a crafted piece, and then sending to him to really connect, and I think sometimes we have these expectations that the poem has to do so much more than that, and I think it's important to remember that it can just connect to one person.
You write about personal topics like
Mhm.
infertility, chronic pain from
Mhm.
scoliosis, and aging. What is your writing process like?
Yeah, it's funny, I write almost every day, but I keep saying that I don't write poems every day. But, like you, I do a lot of journaling, and I keep my notebook close. And then what happens is that I will have moments where, I'm sure just like you, where the day is very packed and very full, and then moments where I have an hour or I have 2 hours and I'm so excited and I think, "Oh, okay." And I will open that journal that has those seeds or notes or lines or images, and from there, I'll start to unravel a poem. And, so I mean, I write daily, but I wouldn't ever say that I write a poem a day. I used to think that I needed to write a poem a day to call myself a poet, but I don't do that. So I think that, I probably write a few poems every month, um, maybe a little more than that. But yeah, I write a lot, because to me it helps me, stay grounded.
One of the things writing styles that I love is rhythm, and your poems have been described as melodic. Is that intentional?
Yes, thank you for saying that. For me, rhythm is incredibly important. Music has been a big part of my life. In fact, I was in a band once in in Brooklyn. It was wonderful. I was the singer and the songwriter, and but I feel like one of the things that I've always loved is the music on the page, and some of my favorite poems have that kind of idiosyncratic rhythm that it only exists in that poem, and there's so much beauty to that, to create that music on the page. I compose most of my poems out loud. That means that I mean, I am writing them, but I'm saying them out loud, almost line by line, because I need to hear the music. Um, and it's not just about how the poem, is working or what it's saying, but how the line breaks are instructing the music of the poem, and how the silence, the space, the caesuras and the stanza breaks and the white space around the page itself, all of that is breath work. So yeah, music is incredibly important to me, in not just how I compose my poems, but how I receive other people's poems. Um, and it makes for me the poem just all that more alive and vibrant.
And I imagine that also applies when you read them. When you read your poems out loud. As a former theater major, am I correct on that?
Yes,
How do you
undergraduate degree in theater, yes.
how do you incorporate that into the way that you read your poetry?
Yeah, I hope that I do service to the music of the page and the music that I've created on the page. And I do believe that I would like to give someone who's listening, maybe for the first time, or maybe hearing a poem they like out loud. I would love to bring that poem to life, so I try to give it my all and try to perform in a way that stays true to the integrity of the poem. And I will lean into the music, I think, when I read. The one thing I try not to do is get so into the performance that I sort of forget the moment, because a big part of me when I read is to be super present. And so that there is an exchange of energy between the audience and me on stage. That it's not just me with a set list performing, but instead that there's a back and forth, there was a reciprocal relationship between the audience and me. So that's a big part of what I do when I read on stage. But I will say the undergraduate theater degree was a big help in reading poems. One is because we think about breath a lot, we think about the body a lot in theater, but also that you really pay attention to what it is to offer something, to someone while you're on stage, and to consider the audience. And I sometimes think as poets, we spend a lot of time alone in our rooms writing. It's true. And then we get to hang out with each other and be in community with each other, and suddenly we come to life. And I think sometimes we have to remember to, bring that life to the stage too, because oftentimes we forget. We're in the small craft of making that small thing, and then suddenly we have to go, and that goes out to the audience, right? So, yeah, it's sort of the two worlds, the self that writes the poem and the self that performs the poem are they're not necessarily divided, but they can be at odds sometimes, because one of them really needs to protect the artist and be quiet and small and inward, and the other person needs to project and be outward and be and protect themselves a little bit too, in a different way.
Well, so we're quickly running out of time, but I wanted to get to your podcast, The Slowdown. It was
Yeah,
previously hosted by the U.S. Poets Laureate Tracy K. Smith.
yeah.
What do you discuss on the show, and how'd you get into podcasting?
Yeah, it was a real gift. They contacted me and asked me if I was interested in applying for the host job, and I said yes. And it's been an incredible year of doing it. I love working with the two producers, Micah Keelbaum and Jennifer Lai before Micah, and they're incredible people. And what we do is we choose one poem a day, and it's by uh, there's so many different artists that we bring on, so many different poets from all over the world, and so that's been a beautiful gift. And then there's just a small little introduction. I think of it as providing a little space for the poem to be received in. So I just tell you a little something that may have to do with the poem, and then I read the poem, and it's only 5 minutes, and it's to me, I think it's a really special experience. I listened to almost every single episodes of Tracy when she did it, and stepping into her shoes has been a wonderful way to spend the last year.
I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question before our time runs
Yeah.
out, and that's what do you want people to take away from your poetry? We're on this, the hurting kind, and this being a moment when we need poetry. What do you want people to take away from it?
Yeah, I think a big thing for me would be just permission to feel. I think we're in a real danger when we don't have access to our emotions, when we don't know how to name them, and we don't know how to speak how we're feeling. And I think that can really hurt us as humanity, and I really that worries me. So permission to feel, and permission to be in wonder, and permission to appreciate joy.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Ada Limon, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be with you.
And thanks to all of you for joining us, for tuning in today. To check out what interviews we have coming up, head to WashingtonPostLive.com to find more. I'm Arelis Hernandez, and thank you for joining Washington Post Live.